I didn't dress for the occasion today. I'm feeling rather femme today, so you have to excuse me. All right. Okay, I'm sorry. So you were talking a little bit about genuineness and authenticity, right? That you feel that you want to be able to make those relationships, and this is a part of you, right? Okay. Anything else? Okay. I am too. So I'm out as well. I'm out with my my staff, which you can see, my wonderful associate director, and I am out with all of my colleagues. I'm out with my boss. I wouldn't say this is always easy, but I would say this is something that has been important to me for a similar reason. In all fairness, higher education is a little bit more open, and that is one of the reasons I like higher education. Right. When we look at how people come out, when they come out, if they come out, we find that this follows a pattern. And it follows a pattern similar to the way we come out in general, right? So has anybody heard of the CASA's model of coming out? Okay, so it's a developmental model that looks at the phases people go through developmentally, and this is where the psychology apology comes in, right? The phases that people go through in coming out. And we find that people go through something similar when they're starting to decide whether or not they want to come out at work or whether or not they can come out at work. So these are some environmental concerns. So the first process that most of us have gone through is the identity confusion of who am I? And so what we're doing is we're looking at all areas of identity. So I also identify, in addition to being a genderqueer, I do identify with being from a very small town. So I have a very low socioeconomic status, right? So I'll identify with that. We might also identify with race. So we're looking at our identity within all contexts, right? About the same time when we start thinking about this, we also start thinking about where do we belong within, say, medicine or within science. And this is how we kind of follow this as we go. The next step then is comparison, and in looking at is this really me? And could this be me? So when we start looking at who we are, we're also comparing, like I said, to different people or different, say, symbols by field. When we're looking at different industries then, in higher education, for example, I was looking to see what do they usually hire for? Do they hire for diversity? Do they seem to care about diversity when they post their job descriptions? Is that important? Is there a diversity statement on Stanford's website? Then we start looking at our tolerance. I probably am LGBT, and so now I'm starting to look at LGBT-friendly role models. And so I am definitely going to go, when I'm looking at jobs, I'm going to go to the LGBT CRC, for example. So when my ex and I decided we were first going to move to California and move to Stanford, one of the first things we did is we reached out to Ben Davidson on campus at the LGBT CRC. And we asked him about the climate here. What is the climate like? And so those role models are they're the ones that will tell us, yeah, it's really pretty safe here, I'm out, or most of us are not, or this is what the climate is. When we move into more acceptance, we're just looking at people who are actively gay, right, who are LGBT. So I don't know what your experience was, but when I was first coming out, I was just happy with anybody. Anybody who didn't like roll their eyes when they heard the word queer, I was like, you're my friend. And they may not have actually been my friend. It was just really nice, but they weren't ashamed of it, or they didn't walk away from it, right? And so this is a very big difference, and I think it can be difficult within work, because sometimes we will mistake people who have maybe an LGBT identifier or like a rainbow flag for being LGBT or being really close friends, right? I noticed this at the doctor's recently. The woman had a rainbow flag on her ID badge. And I said, I'm really glad that you have that. That makes me really happy. It makes me feel included. And she looked at it and said, oh, well, they make us wear this. And I thought, oh, wow, that's really bad. We need to talk about the training that they have to go through, because I made this mistake of thinking this really was an ally, even though we've got this. So I mistook that. Then when we start talking about immersion, we're looking more like at media role models. And this is where it's dangerous sometimes, especially for people who are younger and they're starting to look at careers. So how many people in politics are LGBT and out? And if there aren't many, how many doctors are LGBT and out? And how many, of course, scientists are LGBT and out? And if there aren't, that influences whether or not we want to go into the environment and whether or not we think we can be a doctor, be in policy, et cetera. Right? So these are some of the things we start looking for, but can also be discouraging as we go. And then finally, when we're starting to clarify what we want to do, this is what we're going to try to do today, is looking at our values. What does safe then mean to us? So there's some assumptions that we make. We assume that if there are role models, then they are going to be really good. If they're wearing a flag, they are really going to be very, very accepting. And as I learned the hard way, unfortunately, that's not always true. But I'm also then going to have to define for myself what safety looks like. For me, it's beyond the flag. For me, it's do we have conversations about diversity in general? I don't have to have a boss who is LGBT. I do have to have a boss who doesn't necessarily care, right? And so some of this, whether or not we come out, depends a lot on our own values. How important is it for us to be out? How authentic, how important is authenticity for us? How often is it going to come up? I noticed that I used to live in a residence hall, or I currently live in a residence hall. I'm getting ready to move out. I'm a resident dean or a resident fellow. And I used to live in that position with 90 freshmen with my ex-wife, my now ex-wife. And coming out was extremely easy then because I just had this other person, right? And now I don't have that other person. So I technically don't have to come out if I don't want to. And I have to come out if I'm going to, right? And so that presents, so it doesn't come up as much, right? Unless I bring it up. Okay. So 53% of LGBT people do hide their identities at work. And so this means they either are out to nobody or they're only out to some extent. Out varies a little bit though, because there are levels of openness. So only 26% of the workforce interviewed are open to everybody they meet. 13% are open to most, 7% are open to half, and then the rest, like I said, are open to a few and not open to any. The reasons for hiding, though, is very interesting. I would have guessed something different. I would have guessed a fear of discrimination. I would have guessed that they thought it didn't come up much or it wasn't relevant, but people do think it's nobody's business. What's interesting, though, is, again, when we interview people about why they don't come out, when they say it's nobody's business, when we push, it's more that they believe that other people think it's nobody's business. So there's a significant shame component to this. And one of the things we do in our office at the School of Medicine's Career Center is try to work through some of that shame and figure out why, and if people really do, if people in your office really do think it's not their business, or if we just have this kind of hidden fear that it's not. Okay, but the majority of people say it's nobody's business. I think 64%. That's what they say. These are some of the other reasons. It makes others uncomfortable. A large portion of people say that when they bring it up at work, when they mention their partner, which saying my partner is a pretty basic thing to say. You know, just saying I'm going to the movies could be anybody, but when I say I'm going to the movies with my partner, a large portion of people in the workforce say that they get head rolls or people look down and are worried about this. So it's an uncomfortable thing. Fear of being stereotyped, fear of losing friends or colleagues. People may think I'm attracted to them, I'm not professional, and it's the fear of discrimination, of course. Okay. However, every workplace does have its own personal components. So how many of you do talk to your lab mates about things like your partners to some extent? Or how many of you have heard them talk about their spouses or partners in some way, right? Right? And how many of you think it's inappropriate? Depends on what they're saying, right? But bringing it up, like I'm going on a date with my partner, is not necessarily inappropriate, right? Or is it? Right, if it's every day, right? Right. Well, how many of you have lab mates or PIs who talk about their children? Right? Do you find it inappropriate? Sometimes it's a little much, right? Or a little too much detail, but it's, right? We do this every day, right? How many, I have a dog. How many of you have a dog or a cat and talk about the dog or cat, right? It's personal, right? It comes up, the personal comes up in the workplace. So there is a sense of hiding ourselves in the workplace. So so when people are hidden in the workplace, when they hide in the workplace, the effects are pretty great on the workplace. People will avoid topics, they'll avoid talking about certain things. They report depression. They report moving projects, wanting to leave projects because they feel uncomfortable. They report a distraction. So if there's homophobia in the workplace or perceived or fear of homophobia in the workplace, they feel distracted because that's what they're focusing on as opposed to the project itself. So there are some downsides to coming out and work. And then never mind the fact that the pronoun, we trip over pronouns. So I remember I recently did something with the Graduate School of Business, and we were talking a little bit about identity. And the facilitator said, I can't imagine how often in a single day you were referred to as she. And I think that's interesting. It is true. It happens so often that I don't even notice it, right? And it's based on assumption. Now, if I were, I am cis female. If I were trans and actively going through transition, it would be very, very painful to be identified as my cisgender. Right? So not only would we be dealing with kind of like this distraction of whether or not I'm accepted, I'd also have this kind of severe pain each time, right? So whether or not we come out does matter. It affects how we act at work and who we are at work, which is a very important factor, right? So I'm going to check in really quickly. Is this what you're wanting? Is this useful so far? And you would tell me if not? Okay. All right. So this is what heterosexism looks like. It looks like structural factors. And these, again, to kind of look at the environment of whether or not this is a safe space, we're looking at structural factors. What do I mean by structural factors? Policies, for example. What are the policies around discrimination at work? What are the policies? Do they do diversity training? Do they include LGBT issues in diversity training? Right. Okay. At Stanford, they do. I have been at companies that don't. Right. So what do they have in place? If somebody is discriminated against, how is it handled? How is it managed? Is LGBT considered a group that could be discriminated against, for example, right? Believe it or not, in some companies, in some states, it's not. You're not discriminated against it, or you're allowed to discriminate, okay? So when deciding on the safety factors, that's important. Human relations factors, that is part of the environment. Can I come out? Do I have people who may be allies at work? The political factors, how is it treated? Is it considered a political issue? If I do come out, what is the process? I mean, or if I'm discriminated against, what is the process? The cultural and symbolic issues are things like, am I allowed, are there sexist and homophobic posters and paraphernalia in the workplace? Does anybody say anything about that? I'm actually surprised this still occurs, and it does. And I have a friend who is in Ohio, Actually, my ex-wife is in Ohio, and said that the number of queer jokes that are passed around at faculty meetings is pretty phenomenal. And she's out. And it's treated as this thing of, oh, well, you get it, right? You know I'm just joking. You know I don't mean you. And then critical perspectives of, is this something that we can have a dialogue about if we want to? Right? Is this something that is looked at a greater level critically by the university, by the company, by the organization? Does this make sense? Okay. So what do companies do? This is looking at Fortune 500 companies. And in 2017, more companies than ever before received a 100 score by the human, by HRC. And to get 100%, you had to get a perfect score in all of these areas. Okay, so when we looked at what discrimination looks like, or what heterosexism looks like in the workplace, the first is they include sexual orientation in their non-discriminatory policies. The next is that they include gender identity in non-discrimination policies. And over the last few years, have they just been starting to measure gender? So when they first started the Human Rights Campaign, when they first started looking at this, they were only looking at sexual orientation. Now they've started to look at gender. Next is domestic partner health care benefits. Then we're looking at transgender inclusive benefits, organizational competency. By organizational competency, we're talking about, again, the diversity trainings, the ability to have these discussions with employees, the ability to address homophobia when it occurs in the workplace. And then finally, public commitment to LGBT community. So do they advertise in LGBT publications? Do they make people aware of the policies that they have? Do they openly support this? The other thing that companies do to support is they'll have groups. They'll have support groups. So for example, McKinsey & Company has its own LGBT group for its employees. And that's been something that has been pretty new over the last 5 years, especially within, say, some of the consulting firms that are very focused on inclusion within the workplace. Okay? So to get 100%, you have to be 100% in all of these categories. When we look at this, of course, all the Fortune 500, 92% do include sexual orientation. Not as many are looking at gender, but again, like I said, that's new, so we're very hopeful that this is going to be different. Of the Fortune 500 participants, 99%, of course, are doing this, but then of the non-responders, 75% are not. Right? So that's not necessarily surprising. You could look up the actual companies and organizations, and see, of all 500, what do they offer. So BCG, for example, was very interesting. I looked at them last night in preparation for this talk. BCG is a consulting firm. And they do include, for example, transgender surgery in their healthcare policies. Right? But they do not do as well for LGBT spousal benefits. Right? So this is pretty interesting, right? It's not what we would expect. But it lists out every single possible category of inclusion that a company could offer, every act of inclusion that a company could offer, and it gives you an evaluation of this, right? So the number one this year was Walmart, which is also very surprising, right? Walmart, of course, is a huge conglomerate, huge company, and they received 100%. Apple, for the last 13 years, has received 100%. The top companies a couple of years ago were Bain, Google. The ones in red are ones that I felt would be most relevant to our audience today. So for those of you in the biosciences or tech, these are the ones that I highlighted. The ones highlighted are all companies that we've worked with before, who come to our career fairs, who do presentations with us. Monsanto, for example, is going to be doing an industry on-site presentation for us over the summer. So you're going to be able to visit Monsanto. and get to know them better. Likewise with Genentech. With Johnson & Johnson, we work a lot with them on the entrepreneurship space. Okay. I always find this misleading because you could have a company that gets 100% in the HRC evaluation, but you could have a boss who is not all that supportive, right? And so, this is promising, but it's not a guarantee. Right? So as we start looking at other ways that we assess, will I be supported if there's a problem at that company? Well, we also look at states. So I remember when my ex and I were starting to decide to move out of Ohio, we decided California was going to be one of those options, because it was protective of LGBT rights. At the bottom here is a state map of the states that are considered LGBT friendly. And I wrote them down. There's about 20, and if I can remember them: Washington, Oregon, California, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, Minnesota, New Mexico, Iowa, Illinois, New York, Maine, Massachusetts, Delaware, Maryland, New Jersey, Vermont, DC, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Hawaii. There are two that do not include gender, and I believe that's New Jersey. And I want to say, I'm not sure, I don't remember the other one, but two of them only include sexual orientation. Again, this doesn't guarantee anything. There are homophobes everywhere. I have encountered that here in California. And the first time I did, coming from Ohio, I was a little shocked. I was like, oh my God, that's why I pay high taxes, because I want to buffer myself. But I did. I was in Yosemite, celebrating my 7-year anniversary with my ex, and now ex. And we had told them, I mean, it's California, so we called, and I said, it's going to be our 7-year anniversary. So we had these dinner reservations. And the waitress was very, very, I would say, unfriendly, and kind of laughed and thought it was funny that we were queer celebrating our anniversary. And we kind of didn't know what to do about it. It was kind of shocking, right? And I tell the story. It ended up working out nicely, actually. I actually said, do you have a problem? And she said no. And I said, well, I'd like to talk to your manager. And so I talked to the manager, and who handled it well, brought over somebody who was very friendly, and a little bit too friendly. I mean, she was like, went a little bit overboard to make up for the other waitress, and she was like, I'm so happy you're here, and have a wonderful marriage, have a great life. I was like, okay, that's enough, I get it. But in a way, I appreciated it too, right? So, I mean, the point is, you've got good and bad, and it's hard to assess this, but these are some of the things that we do. With a boss, it's kind of hard, aside from saying, hey, do you like queers? How do you feel about gay people? It's hard to do. So when we talk about this, we're going to start looking at what people want in terms of workplace issues, what they look for, what's most important, and then we'll talk about how to have these conversations and whether or not we should be out on our CV, how to be out on the CV, how to have these conversations in interviews. Is that kind of where you want to go from here? Okay. So when we looked at Stanford, when we asked Stanford graduate students, what do you want? The first was healthcare for their partners. And with gay marriage being legal, you would think this was not a problem. But of course, there are people who still question it, who still try to keep it, who still try to prevent this. A lot of religious organizations resent having to provide healthcare benefits to same-sex partners. So it still remains number one. Number two is trans-inclusive healthcare. 3 is intolerance of homophobic and otherwise discriminatory jokes, which sometimes you can assess. I mean, sometimes, again, when you're going around and looking at the environment, when you're interviewing, it is something to think about and to be watchful for. A non-discriminatory statement, out managers and professors, inclusive language, and employee network groups, which is what I was talking about before that McKinsey has, and LGBT diversity trainings and marketing campaigns. I remember when I was first coming out, when Budweiser started advertising in Out magazine. I only drank Budweiser, and I don't like Budweiser, but I wanted to give all my money to Budweiser because they were like pro-gay, right? And these things matter. They really do matter, especially when we go back to the earlier stages of development. We're first trying to identify with a company and who we are, who we want to be, and what companies really understand us. So when we start planning ahead, like I said, this idea of, okay, so I want LGBT managers, that would be really helpful, that's a given. How do we know? Actually, we know a little more, we can know a little more now than we used to. If you go to my, my LinkedIn profile, if you study it pretty hard, you'll know that I'm out. I've written about it, about being queer, and I have information on there that, that could identify me as queer. I choose that actively. You would want to make sure that if you choose, if you want to be in the closet, you want to make sure that you're actively taking everything off and scrubbing everything. There are a couple of resources out there that can do profiles, that can look at your profile and see what's coming up. So check those out. There's one that I'll have to look for it. I don't remember the name offhand, but I can send it to you. But do make sure that you're very intentional about it, because you'd be surprised about how much you can find about people these days. I'm intentional, you may not want to be. Right? The same with your supervisors and managers. There are things out there, the people that you work for, that you can find if you look. How out is your network? So I don't have to necessarily be out, but my friends might be, right? Which doesn't necessarily mean I'm queer, but it does mean that I am queer friendly. If anybody finds out that I'm friends with Stephen Collingsworth, they will know automatically that I am queer, or that I am queer friendly, because he is the most out person I have ever met. This is a guy who came out on CNN and then called his parents and said, hey, by the way, I gotta tell you something, right? So what does your network look like, and what do they do? And there's not necessarily a way to scrub that, but there are ways to, if you have to, disassociate with it if you need to. But likewise with future supervisors and future colleagues, who are they friends with? What do they follow on LinkedIn, for example? I follow the Gay Yellow Pages, for example. And again, that outs me, but it helps me, it gives me good information as well. Okay. What organizations does your network recommend? So if you are out to your network and you're trying to assess this environment, what's it like? Talk to them. What companies do you recommend? What companies are friendly? What companies are not? What have you heard? Who do you know who's worked there? What can you tell me about this? And then your resume and CV consistency. I tend to think that certain things like volunteering for the LGBT CRC is very useful. I'm volunteering for the Dyke March coming up, and I think that's very useful. It's an organizational experience, right? It's a leadership experience, especially if you are nascent in your career. We have to take it off if we want to be in the closet, or we have to reframe it. We reframe it or retitle it by using acronyms, right? I know that the LGBT CRC has gone down to the Community Resources Center for this exact reason, right? So we look at Community Resources Center. We might describe our activities as working on outreach for diversity, for diverse populations. And we don't have to necessarily be specific, right? So that's one way to hide it if we want to, okay? Or take it off completely if you're not sure. But make sure it's consistent. Make sure it's consistent with your network or your online profile, okay? Look at their mission statement. I did not apply to any graduate school that did not have sexual orientation in their non-discrimination policy. So check it out. I don't know that, again, it doesn't necessarily guarantee anything, but it is a sign that somebody cares somewhere. It also, if something ever happens, it is also backed up, right? Because if I have a manager or a PI who is discriminated against me, I know that there's something in the university or in that company that will support me, because it's their brand. Their mission statement is their brand. What do you know about their culture? I would find out about their culture, anything about their culture possible, not just around sexual orientation and gender. I would want to know everything I can about about their culture because I'm going to be working there. And in the case of an academic job, you're maybe there longer than like that job lasts longer than a lot of marriages, right? So we want to make sure that this is a solid environment. And what does your supervisor's social media say about them? What have they posted? What do their friends post? What do they say about them? What is their environment or their culture based on that profile? So I talked a little bit about job searching in resumes and CVs, leaving affiliated groups off, obviously, or use abbreviations. I would talk to my references as well, depending on how relevant this is, and talk to them about what they recommend. If you are wanting to be in the closet, if you are changing your pronouns, which I have had friends who recently have been on the job search, usually use he, him pronouns with me. On the job search, used they, them, or use their cisgender pronouns. And so had I been a reference, I wouldn't have known, and I would have been using he, him, and they wouldn't have known what I was talking about. So if you're changing your pronouns at all, or if there is a dual body problem that later on that you're going to be negotiating, and you want the future employers to know something about that, then they need to know. You have to talk to your references about what you want them to say, what is okay to say, what is not okay to say. Okay? And they can get your back as well in some way. And then volunteer and activism as leadership. Like I said, I do think some of these things that we get involved in are really good. And I don't think, as I said, things are getting better. When we look at a large portion of the top 500, the Fortune 500, a lot of them are doing really well in some of these in a lot of these categories. So I think things are getting a little bit better. So I don't always approach this with an assumption that they're going to be negative. Also, to your point, I really don't want to work at a place that's going to require me to hide, right? And so I put it on there anyway, and I figure if you don't like me, you don't like me, and I'm not going to like you too much either. Interviews, I've had 2 really bad experiences with being out in interviews. I had one where I was interviewing for a career counseling position, oddly enough, a few years ago. And asking anything about marriage, by the way, or family, is illegal. It is, you can't do that. And by nature, then, asking about sexual orientation is illegal. However, I was in a small town, and they asked me, I got the sense that they knew I was queer because it was a small town, and the way they asked the question, they said, so do you have family? And I said, yes. And I left it at that. And they were like, oh, well, they said, are you close to your family? And I said, yes. And they kept trying to grab and figure out like what I was going to say. And then they finally said, are you married? And I said, yes. Now, this is not a lie. This was before marriage was legal. But to me, we'd been together for about 15 years, so we were married. But, you know, that's a hard thing. And I didn't get the job. And later on, I found out it was because of some homophobia. And I'm really happy that I didn't get the job as a result, right? Now, my options are interesting. I could certainly do something about that. I could certainly do something legally and pursue something if I wanted. I would have had to prove it. I would have had to spend a lot of money to do so, and it would have been very painful. But you do have the right to do that under employment law because it's not legal to be asking about family. The other experience was somewhat similar where they, I think, knew I was queer. I was working in a very, very small town in a drug and alcohol clinic. The person before me had been fired because she had come out to some adolescents. And they brought this up. I didn't know she had been fired for that reason. So they were asking some kind of questions, kind of trying to come around that. And they said, do you know why she was fired? I said, no, I didn't know, and they told me. And I said, oh, okay, I assume you're asking me this because you know I'm queer. And of course, he's, oh, no, I didn't know that. I'm like, yeah, I'm sure you didn't know that. But okay. But what I did is I said, well, here's how I approach this. So especially as a therapist, I don't come out to everybody. I don't necessarily push this. I don't, because that's not what therapy is. Therapy is about the client, right? And so I said, if this were to come up and be relevant, then I might actually say something to a client because it would be relevant, it would be supportive. But no, I don't necessarily think that it's always relevant. And this goes back to, again, if you're going to come out, how likely is it to come up? Right? I've had some students who are environmentalists and they work all day in the field. They may not see their colleagues more than once a month. And so to them, nobody notices. They don't talk about these things. They're not somebody who brings this up very often. They don't talk about their family very often. But for me, it's somewhat relevant with my my colleagues. It's not. It may or may not be with my clients, right? So the way I answered it in that situation was I answered to their real concern. Their real concern was not necessarily homophobia. Their real concern was we're in a conservative area. So you have a couple of options. You can kind of avoid the question like I did the first time, or you can address what the real question is or the real concern is. And by the way, that's similar in a lot of things. So if when they're bringing up family issues at all, with maybe gender in an academic interview, often people bring up gender in an academic interview not because of sexism, but because they want you to know if you have kids, we have a great school system, right? Sometimes that's what they want to know. And they unfortunately do this half the time, most of the time, to women, cis women. And I think they should do this to everybody if they're going to do it at all, because cis males are also parents, right? But that's often the reason they're doing it. They're wanting to sell you, right? So the way we address that kind of illegal question is similarly, we can avoid it. We can say we prefer to talk about it later. We can say, or we can address the real concern. Oh, it sounds like you're concerned about this, or it sounds like you want to tell me about the school system. Is that accurate? I'll keep that in mind if I ever want to have children, or if I'm considering children, right? Does that help? Do you understand? Okay. Again, so we're looking at doing a cultural audit ahead of time. What do we expect from them? Plan your answers, though, to common or personal or illegal questions. I have had people who have been going on the interview and they didn't think until the day of whether or not they were going to try to use their cisgender pronouns or their preferred pronouns. Think about it ahead of time and think about what the impact is going to be if you decide to change from your preferred. While they're planned to meet with potential allies, so if possible, I'm thinking again if in an academic or a medical center where you have a full day interview, but this is also possible, say at Google. If you know you're going to be on campus at a company or at a university, look up the LGBT groups there and have a conversation with them. See if you can have lunch with them or coffee at a break, or email them afterwards. I had a wonderful time while I was visiting your campus or while I was at your company. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about the environment so we can get a sense of this. Finally, your physical appearance. I got this. I gave a talk at OSTEM a while ago, and one of the questions was, what if I'm obviously queer? And I think, boy, I don't know what does queer look like, really. But there is a stereotype, right? And so to me, you have options, right? And the option really does come down to how do you want to present? We know from research that most people, when they meet somebody that they don't, who does something or presents in some way that's uncomfortable for them, whether that's race, gender, sexual orientation, at first they're uncomfortable, and after they get to know the person, they're much more open. We know that just from research, right? So do we want to take the risk, though? Do we really want to take the risk of presenting one way and being another and hoping that the person opens up in time? The majority of the time they will. And a lot of the time, if policies, if there are some structural factors in place, they don't have a choice, right? But that's difficult. As we said, it can be a distraction. I do think that there are some things that are just more professional than others, and maybe this is my age, but I do think that that wearing a suit most of the time is professional, right? I do think that a lot of people do judge excessive earrings and a lot of jewelry and so on. I think that can be cumbersome for a lot of people, right? So we try to steer clear of certain things just because of professionalism. But if that's who you are, then I think that's who you are. And I think that it's better they know you now than later. That's a personal preference. And again, whether or not that's going to be an issue in your field depends on the field. You want to know your sector really well. So the dual career couple is an issue, at least in academia, sometimes in medicine. What happens then when your other half is queer? Technically nothing. Technically it's the same thing. Technically, especially if you're married, technically we do the same negotiation. That does mean you're coming out at the same time. As with all negotiations, we want to make sure you have an offer in hand already to protect you. So that would be whether or not your partner was queer. You would want the offer in hand before you start the negotiation. Okay? The other option, as I see it, is to not negotiate that. Maybe they come back, maybe they come later, or maybe you talk with HR privately to see if you can help. But the best thing for you to do in this case is to be out. Start with an ally first. Talk to the LGBT Center, CRC, or whatever the equivalent is there first to get a sense of what it's like there. Finally, when and how do you come out? The majority of people come out, when they come out later. So they wait till they've been there for a while. I remember my first time coming out in the workplace was when I was working in this drug and alcohol clinic. There's a woman named Connie. And we were a clinic of maybe 3 or 4 people, so we were always in each other's business. And Connie was a lot older than me, and we were in a very conservative place. But I was having a hard time talking about my weekend with Connie. So Connie would say, "What are you doing? What did you do this weekend?" I'd say, "Well, we went to the movies, and then we went here, and then we went here." And when I finally decided, oh, hell with it, okay, I'm queer, I've got this woman that I've been with for a long time. She goes, "Yeah, I figured, because you never use pronouns." I was like, okay. But that's how I chose to do it. I tested her out first. And by the way, that's what most people do. They'll test it out first. So they'll mention something in the media that they read about. Or they'll wear something with a rainbow on it that day and just see how people react. That's how the majority of people do. I think that was the best thing for me to do with Connie because I was very young. I didn't trust because it was a very conservative area. As I've gotten older, I A, kind of don't care. B, don't have to care. I have a little more power now than I used to. And C, just prefer, again, to be authentic. But that has been my choice. So now you see me, it's, "Hi, Stephanie, they, them, there, queer, any questions?" Okay. But that is how I approach it. I think my dean, the dean that I report to, Senior Associate Dean, I think I brought it up with him. I think something with relationships came up, or we were talking about diversity or something, and I said, well, I'm queer, and this is something that I can bring to the table, and that's how I approached it with him. Right? But yeah, most people do some of that searching around, or they'll ask. As I said, I tend to think that in our work relationships, we spend a lot of time with our colleagues. We spend more time thinking about and doing work than we unfortunately spend with our families most of the time. So when we're trying to decide where we want to go, keep that in mind. Are these people you want to work with? Are these people you like? Can you be vulnerable with them? Because sometimes the collegial relationship is vulnerable, and coming out is about vulnerability. And so I try to take a risk, and so most of the time that's worked out. Should the worst happen, document everything, every single thing that is said, every time, every minute, exactly what time it happened, where you were, what exactly was said, what you said exactly, because that is what you will need if you ever need to go to court. Refer to existing policies. Look at the policies as they exist. Look at what they say, what the specifics are, and then start looking and comparing your situation to that to see where there's some alignment. Speak with your HR or ombudsman. If you can, talk to your supervisor, but sometimes the supervisor is the problem. So the ombudsperson, if you don't know, is a confidential resource here in universities. Human resources is also on campus, but then also that's who you would be dealing with if you were in industry. You have a right to ask for a second opinion as well if you're in industry. So usually HR departments are huge unless you're at a startup. Work with and through your allies. So I think it's always good to be talking to people who are like you to see if they're getting similar, if they're having similar experiences. If you ever have to build a case, several examples are better than one. 9% of LGBT employees have left because of an unaccepting environment. When you are in a situation that's uncomfortable, you have three options. The first option is to change the environment. The second option is to stay and put up with it, and the third is to leave. These reflect people who chose to leave. It doesn't necessarily say how many people were discriminated against and stayed. But like I said, things are changing. I think things are getting a little better. According to HRC data, they're significantly better. When we first were looking at this study, the numbers that we saw, that 92, that was originally 47. So since 2002, there's been a significant change. These are some of your resources: Human Rights Campaign and the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, Lambda Legal, Gay Yellow Pages, and Graduate Career Collection. This is our resource library that Deborah manages. We have a few books in there in both e-library as well as hard copy at Lane Library that talk about this. So anything that you would want to know is in there. If you have suggestions for this collection, do let us know as well. We're constantly trying to expand, especially around issues of diversity. Okay, so this is my first time giving this talk in a long time. I gave it several years ago. So I would love your feedback. I gave you a feedback form. I love specifics. I'd love to know where I can change. Most importantly, I'd love to know what your questions are at this time. Otherwise, I'll assume it was perfect and that I've addressed every single thing you've ever wanted to know about LGBT issues in the workplace. Yes? There's a couple of things. I mean, I think, yes, I do go through social media, and you'd be surprised how much is out there about people. So yeah, I do that. But I have a pretty extensive network at this point. So I'll go and look and see who we have similar connections with, and I might email them and say, hey, listen, I'm interviewing at this place, or I'm applying for this job, and it looks like you're connected to my supervisor. I'm wondering what you think in general about their style. Is there anything I should know? If the connection knows I'm queer, then there's kind of this wink wink. Otherwise, I might say, especially as a queer person, I'm a little concerned about the environment. What do you think? Yes? Yeah. 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 Of course. Sure. So tell me about awkward. What do you think would be awkward about it? Hmm. Yes. Uh, they could experience it as rude. Yeah. Um, so, of course, my perspective is it's rude to ask, right? So, but you're right. We're in the middle of dinner, and that's when it comes up, right? And we're trying to be friends, and these are people that I'm going to spend a long time with, right? And so, yeah, I think there's the first option, like I said, yeah, I do have somebody, is different. You can do the Connie route and not use pronouns, right? Yes, I'm very happy. I've been with somebody for about 20 years now, and we're very happy together, right? Um, Anymore, now that the standard has been they them, you can use the they them pronoun. My partner and I are very happy. They are also in academia. Which is confusing to people because that hasn't quite caught on yet. But in academic settings, it's catching on a little more. Um, but I don't know that you have to go into a lot of detail. I think you can say, yes, I'm very happy. I do have somebody who is also in academia, and yeah, we're thinking about moving here. What's it like? Um, but yeah, I mean, I think you have to decide ahead of time, like I was saying, how much you really want to talk about this. Do you want to be out? Um, do you want to talk about this? It's an awkward, it's a personal thing, and sometimes they're asking for a good reason. So the other option is to ask why. Oh, can I ask why you're asking? Do you have somebody? Or do you have a good school system here? To get a sense of why they're asking. Right? And that's been very common. And a lot of people on panels, a lot of our academics on panels, that's what they've recommended to say. Oh, yeah, that's an interesting question. Can I ask why you're asking? Do you have a lot of policies on family and dual partnerships and school systems here? Right? And get a sense from that. And that also, by the way, can skew the conversation into the right direction, which is the job, right? And gets away from the more personal side of it of, gosh, yeah, this is somebody I'm dating and I'm in love with, and it's going to be different, right? Does that help? Yeah. I mean, I tell the other story because it's an option. You don't have to answer it. It's personal, and they're not allowed to ask, but they do. They don't ask during but you're still an interview. If until they've made you an offer, they're interviewing you and you're interviewing them. Okay? And I mean that when they're picking you up from the airport, they're interviewing you. If you're using the bathroom next to your future boss, they're interviewing you. I mean, it doesn't count. Like if it doesn't count. Like if you're just walking by each other and they happen to ask, oh, hey, do you have a partner? They're still interviewing you. And you're interviewing them, though, right? So if you're feeling awkward, if you feel like they're asking a question that's not appropriate for the wrong reason, then that is awkward, and I would listen to awkward. And that's the one thing I've learned about being out. From being out for about 24 some years, is if it feels awkward, it's awkward. Right? This is, you have to kind of listen to yourself. And if I feel awkward and I want to, I'll try to clarify in some way. Yeah. Yeah, yeah, okay. Boy, they should not be asking that. I can't get over this, but they do. So I think there's, again, you have options. Option one is to say yes, and then later on they find out that it's not a boyfriend, right? Option two is, oh, I'm seeing somebody, yes. Do you have someone? And it gets rid of the pronoun. It's the Connie that I call it. It's the Connie approach of getting rid of pronouns. But then again, the other option is to redirect. I do have somebody. Why is there a dual career question here, or something to that effect? Do either of those options sound okay? Either of the three? Right. Well, you know, the most obvious answer is and you're the one that said you wanted to be authentic. I mean, the most honest answer, the most authentic answer is, well, I have somebody. I have a wife. And yeah, she would be joining us. She would be joining me. It's a risk. And I will tell you, it's a risk I have taken and have been successful with. I have been fine with. And sometimes they go overboard. I mean, sometimes they're so embarrassed that they ask that. It's a very heterosexist question. Do you have a boyfriend or a husband? And sometimes if I say, well, I have a wife or I have a girlfriend, sometimes they're like, oh my God, I'm so sorry, that's great. And then they tell you about all their gay friends, right? and so sometimes I feel like it actually works out okay for me. And then I stand out in the candidate pool because I'm the queer one, right? So it can work out for you. It's a risk. But like I said, I have had success with it. I have found that at least in higher education, it's not been bad for me. I'm also in psychology though, and that tends to be a little bit more open, right? Or we talk about these things a little more, say, than in biochemistry. That's partially because it comes up more in psychology than in biochemistry, right? And so the shock may not be homophobia. It may be that, oh, we don't talk about these things, which is not necessarily negative. So in the beginning, when I was saying, it's really your choice, that it's true. You can take a risk and you can tell them you got a wife and see what they do. And my personal decision has been that if they don't like that, then I don't want to work there. Does that help? I hate these kind of questions. It's hard because the answer is it's in you, right? It's really deeply in you. And that is probably one of our best resources is our office, our one-on-one counseling sessions. If you want to come and talk to us, we all are either we are either counselors or we're in training to be counselors. And it's a private space and it's a safe space. And so any of us would be happy to talk you through that. Yeah.
Healthcare that you mentioned.
Yeah. There's two things. There's the domestic partnership. So from a while ago, people who were domestic partners. So it no longer kind of applies, right? If they're domestic partners. And then the other is there's a lot of the work right now has been around if you're working for a religious organization or a religious institution, so religious universities, right? They believe that being queer is antithetical to their value system. So they do not want to, and this is what some of the legislation is looking at, is whether or not they should extend these benefits when the institutions believe it is against their belief system, right? So that's where they're having problems. is with organizations that believe it's against that. But then you've gotten a lot of people who are kind of coming behind them and saying, well, it's against our belief system too, even though we're not a religious organization. Right? So you get some of these companies that are trying to say it's against our mission statement, which it's not. You sell widgets, right? But yeah, so still people are looking for that. Yeah. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Typically not. No, there shouldn't be. No, because it's legal. You're legally married, so they treat it the same way. If they offer benefits to your opposite sex spouse, then they should be offering it to your same-sex spouse. Right? Legally, they need to be doing that. But people are trying not to do that. And if they don't, it's discrimination. Anything else? All right, like I said, this is my first time rolling this out, so thank you for being my guinea pigs. If you have any suggestions, recommendations, etc., I would love to have them. Again, if you need anything, please do contact us. This is my email, and I should have put our information on how to set up an appointment, but email me and I can tell you how to set up an appointment. It's SciMed Careers at Stanford is what it is actually. And I think it only takes like 1 minute to register. All right. Thank you very much for your time.